So we're now off to, we went from cold Russia now to the tropical continent of the entire Africa. And we're very excited to introduce both Tirumala Devidasi and Devamadava Das, who we had the pleasure of seeing yesterday. So welcome, welcome.
Howdy, howdy. Happy to be back.
Howdy. So both Tirumala and Devamadava are esteemed devotees in their own respect, but I'll leave it to both of them to introduce themselves. I will see everyone later on for, I believe, I forget, but I'll be back for Latin America with Prema Prabhu, and we'll end off the day with North America with Devamadava Prabhu. So I'm very excited. Please enjoy your time in Africa. Tirumala and her whole entire team have put in so much effort, and I know you'll get a chance to see it. Hare Krishna.
Hare Hare. Thank you,
Krishna,
Rukmini.
I'm so excited to be here today.
Nice to meet you, Tirumala. Glad to be
Nice
here
to
with
meet
you
you
also.
too.
I have to first apologize for not being Russian, because after watching the presentations from that country, I was just so moved. Srila Prabhupada really wanted that the culture of the Bhagavad Gita be something that the upper crust, so to speak, of society take up, because as Krishna tells Arjuna in the 3rd chapter, whatever great people do, then common people will naturally follow. And so if they follow this Bhagavad Gita, then it'll be good for everyone. And you can see that's really happening in Russia. You can see that people from the kind of upper crust of the society are taking it to heart, and others are following. So I was very moved by that sharing.
I agree. I must be honest. It was just so moving to see how individuals use their talents just to be able to express themselves in so many different ways, just appreciating the Bhagavad Gita and honoring it. I think the Russian program was just amazing.
Okay, wonderful. How about you take us into Africa now, Tirumala? Tell us what we're going to be seeing today.
So the African program is actually, it's a cinematic production, and it comprises of reflections on the Bhagavad Gita presented by a diverse group of individuals. There were about 30 individuals in total from various countries across Africa, and each of them, put together a little piece, which we'll see in a minute. Personally, I must say that I'd like to just reflect a little bit about this production. I can't help but say that, each individual has come together and, contributed to, this overall piece that honors the deeply profound message of the Bhagavad Gita. And it's like, like a beautiful garland. And with, which just wouldn't be the same if any of the flowers on that thread were missing. And as Vaisheshika Prabhu says, teamwork makes dreams work. And how we do is more important than what we do. So I hope everyone is ready to go on a journey with us through the Bhagavad Gita.
I'm excited now. Let's see.
The personality of Godhead, Lord Shri Krishna said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, Vivashvan, and Vivashvan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. This supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood it in that way. But in course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it is appears to be lost. That very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you, because you are my devotee as well as my friend, and can therefore understand the transcendental mystery of this science.
The first 6 chapters have been classified as the Karma Yoga section, as they mainly deal with the science of self-realization through actions. This section describes the living entity as a non-material, eternal spirit soul, capable of elevating himself to self-realization by different types of yoga, the highest form of which is Krishna consciousness or Bhakti Yoga, as confirmed by the final verse of the 6th chapter. Chapter 4 specifically deals with the transcendental position of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and with the importance of Guru and disciplic succession. Since Krishna's instructions actually begin in the 2nd chapter, Chapter 1 serves as a prelude to the rest of the text. Chapter 2 is a synopsis of the whole subject matter of the Gita. Chapter 1, Observing the Armies on the Battlefield of Kurukshetra.
What follows in the next 3 minutes are some of my reflections on Chapter 1 of Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita opens in dramatic fashion with 2 armies poised for battle. Undoubtedly, this was the largest of all world wars in recorded history. Imagine 640 million soldiers with hundreds of thousands of horses, elephants, chariots, all assembled at one location with all the concomitant arrangements for food, shelter, repairs to equipment, and medical attention for both man and beast for 18 days. And then one begins to get a grasp of the scale of this fratricidal war. Brothers killing each other over wealth and property is the plot. Chapter 1 is entitled Observing the Armies on the Battlefield of Kurukshetra. The blind king and villain of the piece is Dhritarashtra, whose name literally means one who usurps the land of another. His eldest son is Duryodhan, and his name means dirty fighter. On the one side, we have these the sons of Dhritarashtra, and on the other we have the 5 virtuous Pandava brothers, who are willing to give up their lives for the sake of righteousness, with Krishna in their midst. Bhagavad Gita teaches that wherever there is Krishna, victory and all success is assured. The most complete glorification of Bhagavad Gita is found within the purport of the very first verse. His divine grace reveals that Bhagavad Gita is the essence of all Vedic literatures, because in it is everything that is in every other scripture. In addition, it contains information that is not found anywhere else. Bhagavad Gita is therefore considered to be the topmost of all scriptures. After observing the armies, Arjuna laments and decides that he no longer wishes to partake in this ghastly warfare. Chapter 1 sets the scene for Lord Krishna to address the root cause of lamentation. Bhagavad Gita reveals who is God, who are we, where are we, why are we here, and how to become perfectly happy. Bhagavad means God and Gita means song. Bhagavad Gita is the song of God intended for all people of all time and relevant at every location within the cosmos. Blessed are those who hear Krishna's words exactly as he has spoken it and intended its meaning to be.
Chapter 2. Contents of the Gita summarized.
We are spirit souls having an embodied experience, a human experience. Sometimes in the course of our spiritual practice, we may be tempted to minimize these human experiences. Yet these same experiences can play an instrumental part as tests and lessons which help to shape and build our understanding and access to spiritual truths and to our original intrinsic identity. These tests and lessons are more often than not quite hard. These can be hard lessons of sorrow, hard tests of duty and responsibility, hard lessons of grief. The second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita can provide some insight on how to approach and overcome these tests through both analytical study and friendly guidance and counsel. This was the case with Arjuna, who was facing a plethora of tests on the Battle of Kurukshetra. The Lord, as his dearmost friend and chariot driver, patiently listened to him throughout the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and in the second chapter he begins to respond to Arjuna. But before this transcendental transmission can take place, it requires one to take a place of submission, of humility, receptivity and surrender, a willingness to take guidance, as Arjuna exemplifies for us in text 7 of the chapter. And so, by leaning in with the same mood of submission, we too can be guided on how to approach our many battles on our personal Kurukshetras of earthly existence. The Lord first speaks in text 11 of the second chapter. His words to Arjuna are initially admonishing, yet the text describes that he delivers these words to his devotee with a smile. One takeaway from this can be the spirit of compassion, of how important it is that we extend compassion to ourselves as well as to others when we're battling with the wars of the mind and struggling with the six enemies. Arjuna does not deny or bypass his doubts, but rather he confides in a friend who can hold space for him, yet still hold him accountable to these eternal truths. And so the Lord, in the spirit of compassion and love for his friend, and by extension to us jivas in the material world, he weaves a tapestry of different topics in the second chapter, which are way too many for me to try to cover in this short. Yet in essence, his teachings and instructions on attaining our divine consciousness offer not only a soothing balm for our material ailments, but the Lord's words, the Lord's divine song performs an incisive surgery, a spiritual surgery for our material woes, for our material distress. As we approach the end of 2021, we are also encountered by how long the past 2 years have been, and how in so many different ways we've been confronted by the many different layers of grief that this human experience is unfolded by. In my own continued pursuit of healing, I am time and time again guided by these different themes from the second chapter. I am satiated by Lord Krishna's response to grief-stricken Arjuna, which offers solace and perennial, timeless guidance to our own grief-stricken existence on this material plane. As we celebrate Gita Jayanti, we celebrate this eternal divine song of the Lord's, which heals our material complexes in so many deep and rich ways. And we celebrate and deeply honor His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada, who has so kindly granted us access to the spiritual healing.
Chapter 3. Karma Yoga.
So chapter 3 starts with Arjuna asking Krishna, why do I need to engage in this battle? So as we know from chapter 2, Arjuna had some doubts because he had to kill some of his mentors and family members in the battle. So Krishna responds in chapter 3 to this question and says, Arjuna, you can't be inactive. You have to do some work. And Krishna explains how we are all under the influence of different modes of material nature and so on and so forth. And so we have various duties. And so he's encouraging Arjuna to fight, but to offer that work to him. So Karma Yoga means that we connect with God through our activities, through our prescribed duties, and through our actions. So how do we do that? We offer the result to God. And in our lives, we have our occupational duties and so on and so forth. And when we do our work, it might seem that we are doing mundane activities. But as a devotee, aspiring devotee, as someone who is practicing Krishna consciousness, we can then offer that result of that same work that someone else might be doing, the same work, but we can then offer that result to Krishna. What does that mean? The result, generally in practical terms, we might be talking about money. How do we offer that money to God? Well, there's many ways. We can engage in the mission of the Lord in some way, supporting that. We can turn our homes into a temple. Even a simple thing like food. We use our money to cook and we need to eat. And so then we can make an offering of that food, a loving offering, and offer that to the Lord. And Krishna explains in this 3rd chapter that if we do not do that, we will eat only sin, actually. So it's a very practical chapter. And it's really a nice point that we might be doing some work and it seems like it's mundane, but if we can connect with the Lord through offering the results of those activities, then our whole lives can also be part of our yoga practice in that way. Some of my favorite parts of this chapter, one is the verse Yad Yad Acharati Shreshtas, where Krishna says, whatever actions a great man performs, the common man will follow, and whatever standards he sets by his exemplary acts, the whole world will pursue. So there's another nice point in this 3rd chapter where Krishna says, it's better to do your own duty imperfectly than to do someone else's duty perfectly. It's also very nice. And Krishna, as he does in various places in the Bhagavad Gita, he talks about himself. So in the 3rd chapter here, he says that he has no work in this material world, and he has nothing to attain, but still he performs prescribed duties to set a good example.
Chapter 4, Transcendental Knowledge.
I have come to deliver you. I've come. As the message was broken, thus I will have to repeat it again.
Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 4, the Transcendental Knowledge.
Transcendental knowledge is delivered through the disciplic succession.
The teaching of Gita was done for the saintly kings, since they were to execute for its purpose in ruling the citizens. Once the chain of disciplic succession was broken, there arose the need to re-establish it. Shri Krishna declares in text 7.
Yada hi dharmasya glani bhavati bharata abhyutanam dharmasya tadatmanam shrijamyaham.
Wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharata, the predominant tribes of irreligion, at that time I descend this.
Paritranaya sadhuna vinashaya jadishvitam dharma sansapanataya sambhavami yuge yuge.
To deliver the pious and to annihilate the miscreants, as well as to re-establish the principles of religion, I myself appear millennium after millennium.
Arjuna was a suitable candidate for receiving this knowledge because he was a devotee of Lord Krishna.
Janma karma cha me divyam evam yo vedi tatvata tatva deha punarjanma naiti mameti sarjuna.
One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not upon leaving the body take his birth again in this material world, but attains my eternal goal. O Arjuna.
Tadvidi pranipatena pariprashtena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshina.
Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized soul will impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. A bona fide spiritual master who is in the line of the disciplic succession can convey the message of the Lord as it is to his disciple, which means a guru can engage his disciple in the devotional service to the Supreme Lord.
The result of obtaining this knowledge is realizing everyone as part and parcels of the Lord. The Lord is the creator of everything. Everything is sustained by him, and after annihilation,
Ignorance is the cause of our bondage, and knowledge is the cause of our liberation.
When one is in complete knowledge, proper understanding of one's constitutional position to relationship to Krishna will immediately turn to ashes all reaction in material activities.
This faith is attained by the discharge of devotional service and by chanting which cleans one's heart of all material dirt.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
But ignorant and faithless person who doubt the revealed scriptures and do not attain God's consciousness, thus they fall down.
Arjuna is advised to slash his ignorance in his heart through the weapon of transcendental knowledge.
Chapter 5 Karma Yoga Action in Krishna Consciousness.
I'd like to share with you a few personal reflections on how the 5th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, as it is, has profoundly changed my life and is empowering me as I navigate in my current journey. I was actually thinking the other day about the fact that as I get older, I seem to be tasked with a lot more responsibility. I've just come out of university. I've started my first job within the industry that I'm qualified for. I've moved out of home, living on my own, and also navigating life as a devotee, working on my sadhana, taking on seva within, my immediate community and the greater ISKCON community. And my meditation has been, Krishna, I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to manage all of this, how I'm going to balance it, juggling these different parts of myself. Almost as if I felt like they should be detached from one another and not working in conjunction with each other. But Krishna has his way, and he always arranges things perfectly. And so it was at a Bhakti Shastri class when we were doing the 5th chapter, when I had to memorize the specific verse in the 5th chapter, and it answered every single question that I had when it comes to balancing my life. And really, the solution is simple: to offer all the results of my work and action to Krishna and put Krishna consciousness in everything. And so I've been doing this little thing for the last couple of months where I've branded myself a chapter 5 Bhaktin, where I try to remember Krishna in everything that I do, and that my constant prayer is, Krishna, I have nothing to give you but myself. You are the maker of all things. You are the ability in man. And therefore, nothing I give you is new to you, but please accept it as an offering, as a sincere offering from me. And give me the mercy and grant me the ability to do more for you, to do more for your devotees, to do more for the world. And so just in short, before I end off the video, I'd like to share that chapter, and specifically one little thing in the purport that is my daily meditation when it comes to action and Krishna consciousness and making everything that I do a Krishna conscious service and a Krishna conscious journey as an offering to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so I'd like to read in conclusion that specific verse, which is the last text of the 5th chapter, text 29. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material miseries. And Prabhupada shares in the purport that the greatest peace formula is simply this: Lord Krishna is the beneficiary in all human activities. Men should offer everything to the transcendental service of the Lord, because He is the proprietor of all planets and the demigods thereon. No one is greater than He.
Chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga.
Bhagavad Gita is the song of Krishna, the song of God. Krishna spoke this Gita 5,000 years ago to his devotee and friend Arjuna. But it is purposely meant for the upliftment of humanity. There are 18 chapters in this book, the Bhagavad Gita. It is a philosophical treatise. And chapter 6 of Bhagavad Gita deals with the mind and mind control. Mind is the master of the senses. Everybody has a mind. In fact, just as we eat to live, we breathe to live, we also think to live. We cannot do without eating, we cannot do without breathing. Similarly, we cannot do without thinking. Everybody is a servant of his mind. The mind dictates to the senses, and the senses carry the body to different destinations. The mind is said to be the director of the five senses, and the mind is so influential in this life. So if the mind is not controlled, the mind makes life very miserable. And Krishna says one must endeavor to control the mind. One must endeavor to uplift himself by controlling the mind. Udarit atmanam manam nan manam avasadayat. That one should upgrade himself, one should uplift himself with the mind. One should not allow the mind to degrade him. He says for the conditioned soul, the mind is the friend, and the same mind is his enemy as well. For one who has controlled the mind is the best of friends. And for one who has not controlled the mind is the worst of enemies. So mind control is very relevant for every being in this world, because everyone deals with the mind. We cannot run away from the mind. The mind is active during the day, directing the senses, and the mind is also active during the night when it is engaged in dreams. So day and night, the mind is influencing us. So if the mind is controlled, if the mind is purified, if the mind is engaged in the service of the Lord, then such a mind is a friend, and such a mind will give us happiness, such a mind will give us peace. But on the contrary, if the mind is not controlled, if the mind is not purified, then one will live in hell even though he is in heaven. Actually, it is said, an uncontrolled mind creates hellish situations, and a controlled mind creates heavenly situations. And we request everyone to make an endeavor to control the mind by chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
That was such a beautiful series of presentations. It was reminding me of one of my personal favorite verses. Krishna says in the 10th chapter, Bodhayantas parasparam, tusyanticha ramanticha, that the thing everyone's looking for, tusyanti, satisfaction, and ramanti, happiness, that comes from the devotees sharing their realizations. Prabhupada even uses in the translation, preaching to one another. So it was very sweet to hear the devotees' reflections on the different chapters and getting the specific essence of each chapter in their life. I was feeling very uplifted by those realizations.
I'd also just like to mention, that in this particular segment, we had devotees from South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana participating. So it was a nice offering from different parts of Africa.
How does it work that the different devotees are speaking on different chapters? Did they choose the chapters, or did you guys choose the chapters for them? How did that work?
So we gave everybody an opportunity to choose which chapter they'd like to speak on.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any specific reflections. I mean, I know you've shared that beautiful verse. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, just with regards to chapter 1, which I found that overview to be so profound by Jagadananda Pandit Prabhu. And the way that he painted, the scene of the battlefield, it was just really beautiful. And, he mentioned that the Bhagavad Gita is meant for all people of all time. And I really appreciated this because it made me think about how the Bhagavad Gita is so timeless and its message can be applied to every situation. And then Bontle in the next chapter, chapter 2, she mentioned, and I really like the way that she described it. She said that, she described our personal challenges as being our personal kurikshetras of our existence. And I just found that to be really beautiful. And and it also makes me think that, there's so much of effort and so much of dedication that's going into the translation of this literature into, various languages across the world. And particularly in Africa, the Bhagavad Gita, as it is, has been translated into Igbo, it's been translated into Creole and Zulu. And all of these are now in the production pipeline of BBT Africa. And there's also the introduction to Bhagavad Gita was translated and published in America. And the rest of the Bhagavad Gita is now being translated into America.
Yeah, wonderful news. That's one of the efforts highlighted during World Gita Day, is seeing what work we have left to do in being able to make this Bhagavad Gita accessible to the world in truth. And that certainly is linked with languages. And Africa is known for having so many different languages. And some of them are obscure in one sense. Only a few 100,000 people may speak them, very rare dialects. And it's very moving to think that the devotees are, in some sense, toiling away and finding more and more and more and more languages which no one else will ever care to know, or think to know the book was published in. But for those few souls who do contact it, it literally means everything. So it's very noble work to hear that is happening. Thank you for that update. Myself, I was just thinking about the relationship to work in this first 6 chapters. It seems like you all have kind of grouped the Bhagavad Gita into the classic 666 formula, where you have karma yoga, and then the next 6 chapters are kind of like, in America, we have this cookie called an Oreo. And the best part of the Oreo is the middle. It's got that's where the frosting is, the cream filling. So the 2 cookies on the outside sandwich this nice frosting in the middle. And these middle 6 chapters are where Krishna really reveals his own heart and invites Arjuna into that deeper relationship with him. And as we heard from in the very beginning, this is a conversation between friends. Krishna and Arjuna are friends. And this next section is where their love really comes out, their affection for each other. So I'm looking forward to hearing the reflections from the devotees in this particular section.
This piece of the Oreo, the cream section, is put together by devotees in South Africa and Ethiopia.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
The middle 6 chapters have been defined as the Bhakti Yoga section, as they principally pertain to the science of the individual consciousness attaining self-realization through devotional service. In this section, the Supreme Personality of Godhead and His different energies and opulences are described. This section especially deals with the relationship between the Supreme Soul and the individual soul in regards to devotional service. Krishna also discusses the nature and activities of such pure devotional service, which he confirms to be the best process of self-realization. Chapter 7, Knowledge of the Absolute.
Chapter 7 is the doorway or the entry into the middle 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, which is the heart of the Bhagavad Gita. To this point, we've seen why Bhagavad Gita is a work of philosophical and spiritual genius. With each verse, we can appreciate the deep theological depth in Krishna's words. Now, the whole chapter, chapter 7, which has got 30 verses, only Krishna is speaking these verses. Krishna wants to give knowledge of the Supreme. And that's the heading of the chapter, knowledge of the Supreme. The knowledge generates faith. In a way, Krishna will present an abbreviated CV about himself, that he is the active essence of everything, he is a source of matter and spirit, that he is the essential ingredient. In essence, he is everything. Krishna says, but Arjuna, this knowledge is very rare. Thousands of people who toil for perfection, and amongst those who actually achieve it, hardly one knows me in truth. But Arjuna, I'm going to tell you about myself. You will know me fully. When you know me, there's nothing else that remains to be known. So how beautiful is that? In essence, Krishna is saying, and he does say that everything rests upon me, Arjuna, like pearls are strung on a thread. Krishna even says that he's the controller of the different modes of nature. These modes of nature are like ropes, they bind one. Krishna is saying, Arjuna, I can untie you. Trust me. Surrender unto me. Through devotional service, you'll cross over this illusion that and old age. Illusion and old age. Because old age is the mascot for death. So if you want to liberate yourself from death and illusion, surrender unto me, Arjuna. Perform devotional service. So Krishna also refers to Bhumi, Apalo, Analo, Vayu, his 8 material elements, where he talks about the material and the spiritual. And he makes the point that Arjuna, I also have a superior nature, a spiritual nature. That's you, Arjuna, the jiva, the soul, which animates this world. There Krishna says that I am the taste of water, I am the light in the moon and in the sun, I am the sacred sound Om in the Vedas, I am the sound in space, the valor in man, the austerity in the austere, the fragrance of the earth, the perennial seed of all beings, and the reason of the rational and splendor of the splendid. So this is a very beautiful chapter. It gives us a very good perspective. Krishna gives us a perspective of his divinity.
Chapter 8, Attaining the Supreme.
The 8th chapter of the Gita begins with Arjuna posing different questions to Lord Krishna. He's trying to understand some terms that are mentioned at the end of the 7th chapter. These include karma, the living entity, material nature, and the demigods, amongst others. Arjuna then poses a final question to Lord Krishna. He's seeking clarification on how one can remember Krishna at time of death through devotional service.
Krishna goes on to answer the first 7 questions quite succinctly, but then focuses in on the last question that was posed by Arjuna. He responds that whatever one remembers at the time of death, that state he shall attain, and therefore we should remember Krishna alone at the time of death in order to attain him.
But how can one remember Krishna at the time of death? Well, through devotional service, of course. And some practical ways to render service are chanting the holy names of the Lord, accepting the remnants of foodstuff known as prasadam, and reading and distributing transcendental literature.
Krishna then speaks about how yogis can attain him through vigorous and various yogic practices. These, however, can prove to be quite difficult for normal people in this world.
A greater emphasis is now placed on devotional service by Lord Krishna. He describes the material and spiritual worlds and the means or processes to attain these different worlds.
He speaks about how when one leaves one's body under different conditions, we can attain different final destinations. But a devotee should not be bewildered by that, because naturally by following bhakti, they will automatically attain Krishna directly, and also automatically achieve the results of all the sacrifices, rituals, and yogic practices that one is meant to observe.
In conclusion, chapter 8 is the perfect segue into chapter 9 of the Gita, which speaks about the most confidential knowledge. A great emphasis is placed on pure devotional service in this chapter as a means to achieve love for Krishna and remember him at the time of death.
Chapter 9, the most confidential knowledge.
So in this section, I'm about to summarize the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So you all know that the importance of the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita is being indicated by the title itself. In Sanskrit, this chapter is known as Raja Vidya Rajaguyam Yoga, or the most confidential knowledge. So Shri Krishna started informing Arjuna by telling him that he's just about to disclose the king of all knowledge to him, because he is dear to him, because he is a friend to him. Yeah. He went on to say, Rajaguya Rajavidyam Pavitram Paramuttamam. He said, this knowledge I'm about to disclose to you is the king of all knowledge, the king of all secrets, the most pure, the most transcendental. And he went on to describe so many wonderful shlokas, and right towards the end, he spoke one of the most important shloka of Bhagavad Gita, Manmana Bhava Mad Bhakto Madhyajimam Namaskuru. He is saying that if you want to return to me, if you want to come back to Godhead, then you have to become my devotee. You have to always remember me. You have to worship me. You have to pay respects to me. So in that way, he spoke this most significant verse right in the middle of the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita has 18 chapters. This was spoken right at the end of the 9th chapter. But then Krishna also emphasized the same point towards the end of the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. In 1865, again he said, Manmana Bhava Mad Bhakto Madhyajimam Namaskuru. And he also informed Arjuna he is disclosing this most confidential knowledge to him because he is non-envious to him. So in that way, Shri Krishna describes so many wonderful shlokas within this chapter. One of them is Maya Dakshina Prakriti Suyati Sacharacharam. He is saying that this whole cosmic manifestation is working under my direction. But then when I come down to earth, fools deride me as ordinary human being. Avajananti ma mudam manishim tanumashritam. So he's saying that Pitaham yasa jagato, I am the father of the universe. I'm the maintainer, I'm the sustainer, I'm the ultimate ashraya, refuge. Just simply by offering me some water, some leaves, some fruit, I'll be very pleased. Patram pushpam palam tegam. He is saying, Gat karosi atashnashi, whatever you do, do it for me. Satatam kirtan tumam itantas jadavataha. He is saying, constantly chant my glories. And towards the end, he concluded by saying, Manmana bhava mad bhakto madhyajimam namaskuru. Always remember me and become my devotee. And that way he concluded this wonderful chapter. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Chapter 10, the opulence of the Absolute.
Today we'll be discussing chapter 10 of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, which is entitled Opulence of the Absolute. It's personally my favorite chapter in Srimad Bhagavad Gita because as aspiring devotees, our goal is to be Krishna conscious. And this chapter gives us so many meditations that allow us to become more absorbed in always remembering Krishna and never forgetting him. At the end of the 9th chapter, Krishna says, Manmana Bhavamad Bhakto. And so in this chapter, Krishna then gives us the meditations and remembrances that allow us to become fully absorbed. And whether these meditations focus on the opulence of the Lord, on the power of the Lord, on the beauty of the Lord, they all serve to increase our faith, increase our remembrance, and allow us to become more fixed in our practice of Krishna consciousness. So in this chapter, it's typically considered in 4 sections. In the first section, Krishna's unknowability is described. And Krishna himself makes the point that the great sages and demigods cannot know him. Only know him in part. What to speak of, minute living entities like ourselves. And Krishna says this to increase our faith in him, in his qualities, in his nature, and to allow us to become more fixed in our remembrance of his name, form, qualities, activities, paraphernalia, etc. And in doing this, to draw out that mood of love, to draw out that mood of service, to draw out that mood of devotion. Krishna also describes the qualities of one, the qualities required in which to seek the absolute truth, which is particularly important for us to reflect on in our path as sadhakas in Krishna consciousness. The next section is the Chatushloki Bhagavad Gita. So the 4 verses which are the summary of Bhagavad Gita. So if you take all the 700 verses and compress that to 4, these verses from text 8 to text 11 represent that. In the first verse, the opulence and position of Krishna as the Supreme Personality and Godhead and source of all is described. Earlier in the chapter, Krishna describes that he is unborn, he is without beginning, and he is Loka Maheshwar, he is the master of all. Thereafter, in text 10, or text 9 rather, Krishna describes the eagerness of the devotees to love and to serve him, and that is a position that we all aspire to, that through our practice of Krishna consciousness we are gradually developing, and from that gradual development will manifest spontaneous love and devotion. And then in the last 2 verses of the Chatushloki Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes how he reciprocates with that eagerness and love of his devotees. We recently just celebrated the month of Kartik, which exemplifies this mood of love. And we see that same mood of love and how that love, Krishna becomes bound by that love, even in the Bhagavad Gita with his interactions with Arjuna, where he takes the menial position of his chariot driver, and through Arjuna's love, he's then directing Krishna. Krishna, take me here on the battlefield, take me here. Thereafter, Krishna then, or Arjuna rather, he then reiterates and authoritatively states the position of Krishna, not just from Arjuna's own reflection, but linking that very specifically to the parampara, to great personalities like Narada, Asita, Vyas. And Arjuna, for our benefit, then asks Krishna to explain some of these qualities, both because, for our benefit, and Arjuna is relishing hearing these nectarian qualities from Krishna. So Krishna then makes the point that he'll describe some of the more prominent qualities, because as we know, Krishna's qualities are unlimited. Lord Balaram, in the form of Ananta, since the beginning of creation, with his thousands of mouths, is glorifying the qualities of Krishna, and is continuing to this day. So Krishna cites some of these more prominent qualities, and these are qualities that allow us to draw our remembrance to the lotus feet of the Lord. And these qualities are described in the context of nature, in the context of philosophical truth. So Krishna emphasizing in the first point that he is the super soul in all living entities. In aspects of nature, where Krishna says, he is the sun, he is the moon of bodies of water, he is the ocean, which is the greatest body of water. Krishna relates it to different demigods, to different qualities, etc. And Krishna concludes by saying all of this is but a spark of his splendor, that one fragment of the splendor pervades the entire universe and sustains the entire universe. So this is the glory, a little bit of the glories of Sri Krishna.
Chapter 11, The Universal Form.
Hare Krishna. So, chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, as it is by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, is entitled The Universal Form. It is the chapter of the big reveal, when Lord Krishna, at the request of Arjuna, reveals his most extraordinary universal form, establishing his identity. Srila Prabhupada explains that Arjuna has full faith, but he makes this request for the skeptics out there who may doubt and underestimate the Lord. And he makes this request in a most submissive mood. And the Lord reciprocates by providing celestial eyesight to Arjuna and revealing this effulgent, inexhaustive, unlimited form that contains everything, moving and non-moving. Srila Srila Prabhupada explains that the Lord is not just presenting himself theoretically or philosophically now to be the Supreme, but as this actual experiential Vishvarup, or universal form. The Lord presents himself as Vishvarup and then as all-devouring Kalarup in the form of universal time, the destroyer of the worlds. First, Arjun becomes stunned, struck with wonder, and at the same time, he becomes overwhelmed with fear. And then he prayerfully requests Krishna to graciously withdraw that vision and present himself in his original two-handed form. And Arjun becomes happy again to see Krishna in this human-like form that he desires. The Lord then explains that this beautiful human-like form is the original form of Godhead. Krishna says, "My dear Arjun, this form of mine you are now seeing is very difficult to behold. Only by undivided devotional service can I be understood as I am, standing before you, and can thus be seen directly. Only in this way can you enter into the mysteries of my understanding." So although it's not possible to see the universal form of the Lord, it's even more difficult to understand the Supreme Lord as He is. But by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, we have been introduced to this most attractive personal form of the Lord. In all our temples, all over the world, this is the form to which our devotion is transferred. This is the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, that he has revealed the absolute truth to us and is teaching us how to see and serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his most confidential form, personally. This is the good fortune that Srila Prabhupada has created for us.
Chapter 12, Devotional Service.
Today I'm just going to be speaking a bit about chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita, devotional service. So growing up, I've always had a problem with this whole idea of God-fearing people, that we usually find in some scriptures. And when I first came into Krishna consciousness, the very first thing that I was very attracted to was this whole idea of how we are God-loving people, which basically means that because of Bhakti Yoga, which means connecting with God through devotional service, that we're basically developing love with the Supreme Lord through devotional service. So that was very attractive to me, and I've always liked this idea very much. So when we look at the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 11, the universal form, we also find that after Krishna manifested the universal form to Arjuna, that Arjuna was very fearful, and we find that this fear, what it does is that it makes one not to be able to serve Krishna fully. Wherever there's a fear, then we don't have the propensity to serve, because it does not, they clash. Those two ideas clash. Wherever there's love, there can never be fear. So I like that very much. So in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna establishes a devotee as being the topmost. And this is also very, very attractive, that Krishna sees the devotee as even being better than himself as God. So, the position of the pure devotee is very special, in the Bhakti Yoga society, or the Bhakti Yoga process. And that's all the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita talks about this very much. And Krishna there talks about the different processes and eventually comes to the point of discussing what Bhakti Yoga is and how it's very, very higher to all these other processes, because there then the devotee is able to connect with Krishna through love. So this is very attractive, and this is what Krishna is teaching in the Bhagavad Gita.
Wonderful. I appreciate how Tribhuvanath Prabhu there in the last segment, and then also the devotee before him, they brought out the intimate nature of what Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna. Sometimes the Bhagavad Gita is kind of pigeonholed as a book of philosophy, but it's first a conversation of love between friends, Krishna and Arjuna, and Krishna happens to be the supreme person, but he's not interested in being the big, powerful, all-destroying God that Arjuna sees in the 11th chapter. As that devotee so nicely explained, she said, Krishna himself is interested in just being intimate with Arjuna, and by extension, also just being intimate with us in a bond of love. So it's very sweet how the devotees brought that out, because that's really the core of what excites me when I think about that middle section of the Bhagavad Gita.
And it's also very practical, this whole process of devotional service. When we got to chapter, I think it was about chapter 8, Radha Rasa and Yavat were explaining, the different forms of devotional service that we can engage in. And they mentioned, reading and distributing transcendental knowledge. And, this World Gita Day celebration in itself is actually part of the Live to Give campaign, which is a global effort to distribute 2.2 million Bhagavad Gitas. And the purpose of this is, to bring everybody together and, celebrate the Bhagavad Gita and its impact globally. And, the names that you can see at the bottom of the screen are actually, those names that are scrolling across are actually the names of the individuals that are participating in this campaign and, making that sacrifice to make this literature available to as many individuals as possible. And so I actually just wanted to mention that and, just have, a moment to appreciate them for all of their efforts.
Wonderful. Thank you for bringing that out. We saw at the beginning in Australia this beautiful series of paintings by a devotee named Bhaktadas. And then also in Russia, we saw some more painting of Krishna's form. And then in the beginning of this presentation, somebody was mentioning about the harmony in the Bhagavad Gita. And in the paintings that Bhaktadas did, he used a very particular kind of art form or style, which just uses little dots, where we call them pixels now. So pixelation, but it was started by a Frenchman a couple, 100 years ago or so, 150 years ago, named Surat, as it goes. It's a kind of a Sanskrit name. And means good taste. And this pixelation creates, if the artist is skillful enough, this deeply compelling image that's engrossing and at the same time made up of all these obviously small little pieces. Any painting is made up of many brushstrokes, but it's not always so obvious. And this particular style highlights just how many small movements and pieces go into making a particular piece of artwork. And I think that's one of the messages of World Gita Day also. When we hear 2.2 million Bhagavad Gitas, somebody might, well, I can't do that. I can't distribute 2.2 million Bhagavad Gitas, but that's not what's being asked of us. What's being asked of us is to distribute 2 or 3, 20 or 30, 200 or 300, whatever our capacity might be, to do our little part, be that little pixel on the page. And in the hands of our spiritual masters, in the hands of Srila Prabhupada and our previous acharyas, in the hands of the Lord, then we can become a part of that beautiful painting and offering back to them, showing our appreciation of the love that they've given us.
That was so beautiful. I actually must say I really appreciate that.
Thank you for reminding us of the true spirit of this Gita Day. And this presentation from Africa has been so, it's really good that Africa followed Russia, because Russia was going to be really hard to follow. But Africa is setting the bar very high with these very cohesive and articulate and really compelling narrations of each individual chapter. I'm loving this. So I think it's a good time now. Let's get into the last section, which is going to be, now we're through the cream and we're back to the cookie. But since it's a Krishna cookie, we still enjoy it. We still like that part. The last 6 chapters are famous as the kind of Jnana Yoga section, where Krishna wraps up some of the philosophical points that he's made to Arjuna, and then concludes with a few famous verses in chapter 18, which I'm sure will be highlighted by the devotees.
So this next section is put together by devotees in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria.
Jai.
The final 6 chapters are regarded as the Jnana Yoga section, as they are primarily concerned with the cultivation of jnana, or knowledge. In the third 6 chapters, how the living entity comes into contact with material nature, how he is entangled, and how he is delivered by the Supreme Lord through different methods of fruitive activities or karma, cultivation of knowledge or jnana, and devotional service or bhakti are all explained. The Gita is actually finished in 17 chapters. Chapter 18 is considered a summary of all previous instructions. Chapter 13, Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness.
This chapter covers topics that have been discussed previously in the Bhagavad Gita, but from a more technical, analytical perspective. The chapter starts out with Arjuna asking Krishna to define 6 items. And these 6 items are Prakriti, which is nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, Kshetra, which is the field of activities, Kshetragya, the knower of the field, Jnanam, which is knowledge and the process of knowing, and Gyayam, the object of knowledge. Krishna begins by defining the field and the knower of the field. He explains that the body is known as the field, and one who knows the body is called the knower of the field, or the soul. And to understand the difference between the body and the soul, one can simply consider that from childhood to old age, the body undergoes several changes. Yet the person who owns the body remains the same. And this is known as the knower of the field, the soul residing within the body. Krishna then describes how the soul can disentangle himself from the body by cultivating jnana, which is knowledge. The method of acquiring this knowledge can be achieved through the cultivation of divine qualities. And then Krishna goes on to list these qualities. Now, true knowledge is not reflected by how much an individual can memorize or repeat. Rather, it is about character, and it is reflected through one's behavior. Krishna then explains the purpose of this knowledge, which is actually to realize the relationship between the soul and the super soul. Mundane logic and material sense perception cannot be used to understand the super soul. And those who attempt to understand him in this way, for them he remains unknowable. However, for those who approach the subject matter in a humble state of mind, with sincerity, and through the eyes of teachers who have understood this knowledge, for them they can realize the super soul, which is actually the object of all knowledge. The final 2 items that Krishna discusses are nature and the enjoyer. Now, the conditioned soul has an innate desire to enjoy the material nature separately from the super soul. And this enjoying spirit is what binds the conditioned soul to the material world and to the body. So the super soul is the actual enjoyer, and everything is meant for his enjoyment. To understand this, one can think about watering a tree. Now, for the entire tree to be nourished, one wouldn't attempt to water each individual leaf or each branch. One will water the root of the tree. So in the same way, when one satisfies the super soul for his enjoyment, all other living entities automatically become happy. So I will end by reading the last verse of this chapter, verse number 35. Those who see with eyes of knowledge the difference between the body and the knower of the body, and can also understand the process of liberation from bondage in material nature, attain to the supreme goal.
Chapter 14. The Three Modes of Material Nature.
This Bhagavad Gita is absolutely powerful. I mean, the commentary and the purports by Srila Prabhupada are just absolutely brilliant, and it really resonates and hits home. Chapter 14 is where I am at today with you. And chapter 14 is the three modes of material nature. These three modes, oh my gosh, as we say in South Africa, they're very powerful. They hold things down, they hold you down, and they are influencing a lot of the things we do in this world while we are in this material world. And, goodness, passion, ignorance, they have the characteristics in which you can identify them. But I'll just tell you, goodness is obviously good knowledge, cleanliness, purity. That's kind of like one level we want to be on, right? Is in a good space, But it's still influenced by the material, by the material nature, which is these three modes of material nature against us. So Prabhupada also, expresses clearly, this conversation that Arjuna and Krishna are having. And he also then says, how does one transcend? Because that's probably the question. You're like, okay, I'm in these three modes of material nature. These three modes of material nature have got me down. How do I transcend it? It's an Arjuna's question as well. How do you transcend it? How do you identify people who have it? And then also, what are the symptoms and behaviors? So Prabhupada really, brings it together for us. And I just love this part, is that we have to move from, I just love this part how he expresses it, is that you have to move from a consciousness, which is what we all have, to a Krishna consciousness environment. And Krishna consciousness environment, or Krishna consciousness is really coming with surrender, because this is the Supreme Lord. And he himself says in the Bhagavad Gita is that this material nature is very powerful and it's very hard to overcome, but the only way to overcome it is through surrender. He says that's 7:14. So we have to come to this Krishna consciousness state, and this Krishna consciousness state is devotional service. It's a platform where we have surrendered ourselves to devotional service to the pleasure of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And having that done, one can experience freedom. And freedom is what we really want sometimes, And real true freedom is when you're in that state, in a Krishna conscious state, not affected by the modes of material nature. You've identified that these modes of material nature does exist and how they influence you. You're in this material world, and our want is to go back to Godhead. And coming back to what our want is surrendered consciousness to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Simple things that we do in our life: offering flowers to the Lord, smelling those flowers, chanting, hearing, seeing the Lord, engaging our senses in the Supreme Personality of Godhead's service and pleasure, and surrendering that way. Chanting the holy name is probably the easiest and fastest way for us to move through these three modes of material nature and transcend and go back to God.
Chapter 15: The Yoga of the Supreme Person.
In this chapter, we get to hear about the relationship between the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the individual living entity, also about what this material world is, what the spiritual world is. So the chapter begins with a very beautiful analogy, discussing this material world to be like a banyan tree. Banyan trees are famous for being very, very big. They can grow into kilometers in size. And this type of banyan tree is upside down, according to Krishna, that its roots are upwards, and its branches, and it gives certain types of fruits, which give certain types of fruits. That is explained that in this world, the material world is like a perverted reflection of the spiritual world. And this is where we are. And as such, everything is upside down here in that it is not in its proper position. The original place is the spiritual world, and the original happiness that we're looking for is found within that spiritual world. But in this world, we simply get the fruits of entanglement, and they are bitter. But Krishna gives hope that when one is freed from the dualities, when one is purified in consciousness, then they can surrender to that Supreme Person, and then the result is that one is freed from this material world and one can go to the eternal world. And this eternal world is very different from this world. There, for illumination, there is no need for sun, moon, and stars, electricity, and fire. That means all the illumination actually comes from the bodily effulgence of the personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna. So it's an invitation to come there. Krishna then discusses that there is an eternal relationship between himself and the individual living beings. He calls us his Angsa. He says, Mama Vangsa Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Manasastani Indriyani Prakriti Stani Kashati. That eternally the living beings are my parts and parcels, but they are struggling in this conditioned world due to the six senses, which include the mind. Pointing out at the problem, diagnosing the source of our struggle in this Kashati Stani. Stani means place, Kashati, difficulty. So this material world is a place of difficulty. Krishna doesn't wish that we struggle as his eternal part and parcel. We are like his children. Therefore, he directs us towards the spiritual world. And the Lord then discusses that without proper spiritual vision, without proper spiritual knowledge, one cannot see how this eternal living being is getting a body at birth, stays for some time, quits it, and gets another body. That vision is only available to those who have been illuminated with transcendental knowledge. They can understand how the living being is actually struggling in this world, being embodied in this temporary body and struggling for happiness. So the Bhagavad Gita is directing us into a position of yoga, union with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore then the Lord discusses how he is seated within the heart of all living beings. Savasya Chaham Ridi Sanivista Mata Smriti Gyanama Pohanamcha. That I am giving from within the heart knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. Then he says, Vedaischa Savai Aham Eva Vedya Vedanta Krit Veda Ved Eva Chaham. I am the compiler of all the Vedas, I am the knower of all the Vedas, and by all the Vedas I am to be known. The goal of all Veda means knowledge. This Bhagavad Gita, which we are going to be celebrating during Gita Jayanti, the appearance of such Bhagavad Gita spoken by Krishna in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Veda means knowledge. So all knowledge, by all knowledge, the goal of all knowledge is to know Krishna. It doesn't matter what knowledge one is culturing. If it does not lead one to understand the source of all knowledge, who is the compiler of all knowledge, Krishna, then that knowledge is as good as illusion, because it doesn't reveal that personality who is our eternal friend and whom we find the greatest happiness in a loving relationship.
Chapter 16: The Divine and Demoniac Natures.
In the previous chapter 15, Lord Krishna explains that He, being the supreme spiritual whole, gives birth to us, the living entities, in this conditioned material world, and we are but His eternal fragmental parts. As such, the living entity shares the spiritual qualities, or the qualities of the Supreme Lord, that of Sat Chit Ananda, eternality, knowledge and bliss. Being fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord, the living entity has a duty to that Supreme Whole. In the same way a leaf has a duty to the whole tree, or a hand has a duty to the body. So the living entity has a duty to the Supreme Whole, that of service. As we understand, the living entity in this material world is engaged in service, and engaged in such a service that they are looking for happiness and knowledge. Although they are doing so in a misguided way, they're looking for knowledge and happiness to please themselves, rather than pleasing the Supreme Whole. And such a tendency is what is here explained as the demoniac tendency, when the living entity, being overtaken by false pride and false ego, considers himself the doer, considers himself the Lord of material nature, and being the Lord of material nature, assumes the rights and privileges of the Supreme Lord upon himself. In such a deluded state, the living entity suffers reactions to their actions, and thus takes birth again and again in this material world, reaping, so to speak, the rewards of their previous actions. So the Supreme Lord here is advising Arjuna not to become overtaken by the demoniac tendency, to think they themselves the Lord over material nature, but to surrender unto the actual Lord, the Supreme Whole, and give Him service. For by doing so, the living entity comes back into their constitutional position, comes back into their full understanding of their identity, that of being a servant, that of being part and parcel of the complete whole, and not separate and independent. So the message of chapter 16 is ultimately that the living entity should know what their duty is, and the only way to know what their duty is to know what their identity is. And the Bhagavad Gita as a whole is a treatise on re-establishing our eternal identity as the servants of Lord Sri Krishna, the Supreme Whole.
Chapter 17: The Divisions of Faith.
Chapter 17 describes the three modes of worship. Krishna explains the three modes of guna to Arjuna. Arjuna asked Krishna which guna prevails in men who worship with faith but reject scriptures. Krishna then explains these three gunas. That's the Sattvic guna, the Rajas guna, and then the Tamasic guna. Now, Krishna went further to explain in detail that the Sattvic guna, or men with Sattvic nature, worship God for the sake of worship. They are able to control the body, mind, and do not have any desired outcome. They usually eat food in the mode of goodness, which is fresh foods, juicy, succulent, that actually brings vitality to the body. These people give charity wholeheartedly without any expectations in terms of returns. Now, men with Rajas nature, Krishna explains that they worship demigods out of desire and for pride and to gain power, to control and to harm or rule others. They usually eat food in the mode of passion, that is food that are salty, sour, bitter, and that brings discomfort to the body. They give charity disrespectfully and half-heartedly. And the last nature, that is the Tamasic nature, men in such a mood, they worship dark spirits and ghosts. They usually eat food in the mode of ignorance, that is food that are stale, pungent, overcooked and contaminated. They give charity at the wrong time and at the wrong place. Now, Krishna indicated that among these three modes of goodness, the Sattvic guna is the quality closest to divinity, and more importantly, because it has positive traits. However, since it is still part of material nature, it has the potential to hold one to repeated birth and death. Krishna teaches us that faith and yoga alone is not enough to liberate one from material suffering, but understanding of the scripture is very, very important. He encouraged Arjuna to take action rather than inaction, and warned him, taking action against scripture or not in accordance to scripture. So when we act against scripture, irrespective of the faith with which we acted, it will not be considered right. Therefore, we are encouraged to, as we take any action, to chant Om Tat Sat, to purify our sattvic actions and to become pure.
Chapter 18. Conclusion: The Perfection of Renunciation.
One of the main things that attracted me to Krishna consciousness was the practical aspect of devotional service. In text 5, Lord Krishna is explaining to us that we should never give up the activities of charity, sacrifice, and penance. And in addition to this, we need to make sure that none of these activities are completed for our own personal gain. Prior to becoming a devotee, my grandmother Vel was the first person that I knew who surrendered to this practice. Although not a devotee, she was selfless in her giving. She was a wealthy person who sacrificed her needs for the needs of others. She gave freely with an open heart. And at the end of her life, when she was challenged by serious illness and suffering, she never once complained. One of the things that have stayed with me over that time was when we came to pack up her belongings. Everything that she owned at the end of her life fitted into one packet. This, in her example, was an excellent example of renunciation. Everyday life presents us with many different challenges. They can be relationship-based, financial, emotional, physical. Many times these challenges can create within our lives great levels of distress and fear. Over my years in Krishna consciousness, the greatest solace that I have found in the lonely and difficult times has come from text 65, where Lord Krishna says, "Always think of me, become my devotee, worship me and offer homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you are my very dear friend." And when I am afraid for any reason, the ultimate instruction from the Lord is in text 66, where he says, "Abandon all varieties of religion. Just surrender unto me. I shall deliver you from all sinful reactions. Do not fear." Hare Krishna.
Always think of me, become my devotee, worship me, and offer your homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you are my very dear friend.
Wow, way to go, Africa. That was beautiful. Tirumala, you were one of the devotees who was instrumental in putting all of that together. Any behind the scenes nectar you want to give us for the effort that was put in and the thought process behind it?
It's really a team effort. I mean, if you looked at the names, scrolling on the screen at the end, there were so many devotees that contributed to this. And, I just feel so appreciative and just so much of gratitude for everyone's sacrifice in making this happen. Because, as I mentioned when we started off, it's like a beautiful garland with out with the single flower missing, you're not going to get that exact same beautiful piece. And I just feel like everybody throughout their difficulties, and there was so much of sacrifice that went through in getting this together. And I'm just really grateful to everybody and all of the guidance that we had in all of the support. So yeah.
It's beautiful to see over the 18 chapters such diverse people offering their reflections and realizations, every size and shape of jiva we could imagine, younger, older, richer, poorer, everyone was there. And everyone was expressing their deep appreciation for what Krishna is giving Arjuna in the Gita. And that's one of the demonstrations that we can practically see with our own eyes of the transcendental nature of this information, is that it really works for everybody, anywhere, whether we're in Russia or Africa or North America or Australia. So really big thanks to the African team and yourself, especially to Ramala, for not only helping to organize it all, but then coming on and hosting it, making sure it would go smooth. And even I couldn't mess it up. It was so well put together.
It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity.
Chai.
Beautiful
Chai.
program.